The air in Hall 7 was cold. Colder than the April night outside. Not the damp chill of the Mediterranean coast, but a sterile, manufactured cold. The kind that emanates from vast volumes of climate-controlled space. It smelled of ozone from the high-voltage conduits, the faint bitterness of machined steel, and a clean, almost antiseptic scent from the polished concrete floor. Yael's breath plumed in the faint security light, glinting off the two colossal structures that dominated the space. They were identical gleaming cylinders of stainless steel and zirconium alloy. Each the size of a city bus stood on its end. The reactor cores for Osirak, codenamed Tammuz 1 and Tammuz 2 by their intended owners in Baghdad, a name invoking a Babylonian god and a month of searing summer heat. Here, in the CNIM naval shipyard at La Seine-sur-Mer, they were simply the product, designated Job 77A and 77B. To Yael, they were the tangible manifestation of an existential threat, the beginning of the end. He checked the luminous dial on his watch. So 2 and 17 a.m. His gloves, thin calfskin leather chosen for dexterity over warmth, offered no protection from the chill biting into his fingertips. He pressed his palm against the cool, curved metal of the first core, Tammuz 1. It was inert, silent, a sleeping giant, but he could feel the potential humming within it. The ghost of the chain reactions it was designed to foster. The promise of 25 kilograms of weapons-grade plutonium-239 per year. A single bead of cold sweat traced a path down his temple, defying the ambient temperature. The demolition charges were compact, shaped with geometric precision, 5 of them for each core. Not military-grade C4 or Semtex. Nothing that crude. These were bespoke surgical tools designed by a man named Danny back in a windowless lab in Tel Aviv. Danny called them core crackers. The goal wasn't obliteration, which would be too loud, too obvious, an undeniable act of war on French soil. The goal was irreparable, catastrophic internal damage. A rupture, not a crater. The charges used a Misnay-Chardin effect, focusing the explosive force into a hypervelocity jet of molten copper designed to pierce the 14-centimeter thick steel pressure vessel and shred the delicate calandria tubes and control rod assemblies within. It would render the core useless, a multi-million-dollar piece of radioactive scrap before it ever saw a single neutron. He peeled the adhesive backing from the first charge. The adhesive itself was a marvel, a polymer that would bond to the steel with immense shear strength, even in the cold. He pressed it firmly against a pre-identified, ultrasonically tested weld seam on the primary coolant inlet pipe. The magnetic clamps, rare earth neodymium magnets, engaged with a soft, satisfying click that was audible only to him. 1 down, 9 to go. His partner, Ronan, was a shadow near the massive bay doors, his silhouette barely distinguishable from the stacked crates and heavy machinery. Ronan's job was to watch, to listen, to be the early warning system. His stillness was absolute, a predator's patience honed over years in hostile territories. Yael moved to the second placement point, his rubber-soled boots making no sound on the polished concrete floor. He was a phantom in a cathedral of nuclear ambition. The plans, memorized over 6 months of relentless drills in a full-scale mock-up built in a Negev warehouse, were a perfect three-dimensional map in his head. Every bolt, every conduit, every weld seam. He knew this machine better than the French engineers who had built it, because he had studied it with the sole purpose of its destruction. As he placed the third charge on the first core, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A flashlight beam, cutting a lazy arc across the far wall, high up near the gantry crane. It wasn't supposed to be there. The patrol schedule, confirmed by Sylvie's surveillance team just 2 hours ago, was precise to the minute. The night watchman, a 58-year-old man named Jean-Pierre Renaud, should have been in the administration wing, a separate building 200 meters away, brewing his 2 a.m. coffee and reading his newspaper. The beam swung closer, illuminating a stack of pallets, then a Taiji welding rig. It was methodical, unhurried, but it was a catastrophic deviation from the pattern. Yael froze, his body flush against the steel core, trying to make himself part of the machine. The charge in his hand felt impossibly heavy, a lump of cold, malevolent potential. He glanced towards Ronan. The shadow hadn't moved, but Yael could feel the tension radiating across the cavernous hall, a palpable wave of focused adrenaline. A static-laced message crackled in his custom-molded earpiece, Ronan's voice a clipped, emotionless whisper. Patrol deviation. Unidentified guard. Location E7. Hold position. Do not move. Hold position. The 2 most terrifying words in the lexicon of field operations. It meant you were compromised, exposed, and all you could do was wait for the blade to fall. Time stretched, became elastic. The flashlight beam danced, a curious firefly exploring the darkness. It swept over the base of the second reactor core, lingered for a heart-stopping 3 seconds, then moved on. Yael's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silent potential of the atom. The beam continued its sweep, moving away from them, towards the eastern wall. False alarm. Or perhaps not. A rookie guard, maybe, taking the scenic route, or an old-timer being unusually diligent. The reason didn't matter. The result was the same. Their operational timeline was now compressed. Yael let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, the air shuddering out of his lungs. He got back to work, his movements now more urgent, the adrenaline sharpening his focus into a razor's edge. Charge 4 on the emergency cooling system valve. Charge 5 near the base of the control rod housing. First core wired. He moved to the second, Tammuz 2. The process was identical, a mirror image of the first. He worked with an economy of motion born from 1,000 rehearsals. The adhesive strips, the magnetic clamps, the thin, shielded detonator wires he connected to a central receiver unit tucked behind a power conduit. So too, 28 a.m. All 10 charges were in place. He pulled the master receiver from his pouch, a small black box with a single shrouded toggle switch and a small LED indicator. He ran a final tactile check of the connections, his gloved fingers tracing the wires in the near darkness, confirming each contact point. Everything was perfect. He gave Ronan a single, sharp nod. The shadow detached itself from the wall and began moving silently towards the pre-planned exfiltration point, a northern ventilation shaft. Yael was right behind him. They reached the shaft. Ronan produced a small, powerful thermal lance. It hissed to life, a tiny blue-white star that burned at 3,000 degrees Celsius, cutting through the locking bolts with surgical precision and minimal noise. The heavy steel grate came away with a low groan of stressed metal. Ronan was through in an instant. Yael followed, pulling the heavy grate back into place. They were in the service tunnels now. Damp, musty air replaced the sterile scent of the assembly hall. Their footsteps echoed faintly in the confined space. They had 40 minutes to clear a 2-kilometer radius before the remote detonation signal, bounced from a satellite to their command post in Sylvie's apartment, was sent. But as Yael checked the receiver one last time before stowing it, his blood ran cold. The LED, which should have been a steady, reassuring green to indicate a stable connection and armed status, was blinking. A frantic, irregular red pulse. It was a fault code. Code 7B. He had seen it only once before, in a training simulation designed by Danny to test for responses to catastrophic equipment failure. It meant the internal quartz timer, the primary detonation pathway, had malfunctioned due to an unexpected power fluctuation, likely from the nearby high-voltage equipment in the hall. The charges were armed, but the remote trigger was deaf. They would not fire on schedule. Aborting was not an option. The charges were designed with anti-tamper mechanisms. Attempting to remove them now would sever a microfilament, triggering an immediate, uncontrolled detonation. He had two choices: leave them inert and useless, a monumental failure waiting to be discovered by the morning shift, an engraved invitation for the Iraqis to double their security and accelerate the shipping schedule, or activate the backup. The backup was a manual chemical-fused trigger, a glass vial of hydrofluoric acid suspended inside each charge, designed to be broken by a sharp, physical impact. The acid would eat through a restraining wire in approximately 2 seconds, releasing a spring-loaded striker onto the percussion cap of the detonator. It was a crude, brutal, last-ditch mechanism, and it had no timer. The detonation would be instantaneous. He would have to go back into the hall. He would have to physically strike each of the 10 charges. He looked at the access grate. He looked at the blinking red light. He had seconds to decide. The fate of the entire Middle East for the next 50 years rested on that decision. A failure here meant a nuclear-armed Iraq, a new balance of terror. There was no real choice. The mission was everything. The blinking red light on Yael's receiver was the culmination of a crisis that had begun years earlier, in rooms far from the cold factory floor. The story of the Osirak cores begins not in France, but in the corridors of power in Jerusalem and Baghdad. By the mid-1970s, the Israeli intelligence community, Mossad, was operating under a new, terrifying paradigm. The 1973 Yom Kippur War had been a near disaster, a catastrophic intelligence failure that shattered the nation's sense of invincibility. In its aftermath, every threat was re-evaluated, every potential enemy capability scrutinized with a new, fearful intensity under a doctrine known as the concept. At the top of this list was Iraq. Saddam Hussein, then vice president, but the undisputed power in the country's Revolutionary Command Council, was not subtle about his ambitions. He saw himself as the new Saladin, the uniter of the Arab world who would finally destroy the Zionist entity. And he believed the ultimate weapon was the key to that destiny. In November 1975, he flew to Paris and signed a landmark nuclear cooperation agreement with French Prime Minister Jacques Chirac. The deal was public knowledge. France would sell Iraq a complete nuclear facility. It was named Osirak, a portmanteau of Osiris, the French high-flux reactor type, and Iraq. The French insisted it was for peaceful research, a claim backed by their participation in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Mossad knew better. The reactor was a 70-megawatt materials testing reactor, a type perfectly suited for producing weapons-grade plutonium. Furthermore, the deal included the supply of 72 kilograms of 93% enriched uranium fuel, itself weapons-usable material, and a hot cell facility, whose only practical purpose was the chemical separation of plutonium from spent fuel rods. It was a bomb factory in disguise. The first line of defense was diplomacy. Israeli Foreign Minister Yigal Allon flew to Paris, pleading with the French government. He presented intelligence, technical analyses showing how the reactor could be weaponized, how its specifications far exceeded any legitimate civilian research need. The French were polite, but dismissive. The deal was worth billions in francs. It secured French access to Iraqi oil at a time of global energy crisis. It was a cornerstone of their Gaullist independent foreign policy, a thumb in the eye of American non-proliferation efforts. The diplomatic channels were a dead end. The problem then fell to the man at the top of Mossad, Director Yitzhak Hofi. Hofi was a career military man, not a spy. A former general who had commanded the Northern Front, he was methodical, pragmatic, and utterly ruthless. He had commanded troops on the Golan Heights and understood strategy not as a game of chess, but as a brutal equation of risk, reward, and acceptable losses. His defining achievement before Mossad was his role in planning the logistical miracle of the 1976 Entebbe rescue operation. He knew how to make the impossible happen. Hofi convened a special working group within the Caesarea department, Mossad's elite special operations unit. The mission was codenamed Operation Sphinx, the objective: to stop Osirak by any means necessary. The team he assembled was a collection of legends. The operational commander was a man known only as Amir. Amir was a veteran of the Wrath of God teams that had hunted down the Black September terrorists responsible for the Munich Olympics massacre. He was a master of long-range, deep-cover operations, an expert in creating and maintaining complex logistical networks in hostile territory. His specialty was psychological composure. Colleagues said his heart rate never rose above 60, even during an active firefight. He was the architect. The lead technical expert was Danny, the man who designed Yael's explosives. Danny was not a field agent. He was a physicist and a chemical engineer recruited from the Weizmann Institute of Science. His genius was in miniaturization and application-specific ordnance. He had designed the pressure-sensitive bomb in a telephone that killed a PLO leader in Beirut and the frequency-hopping radios used by agents in Damascus. His job was to create the perfect tool for any problem, a tool that was both brutally effective and forensically untraceable. The lead intelligence analyst was a woman named Miriam. Miriam had been one of the first analysts to warn of the impending Syrian attack in 1973. Her warnings had been ignored, a fact that haunted her and drove her with a ferocious intensity. She spoke fluent Arabic and French and had an almost supernatural ability to see patterns in disconnected data. A shipping manifest from Marseille, a transcript of a phone call from the Iraqi embassy in Rome, a satellite photo of a construction site south of Baghdad. She built the picture of the enemy's intent: peace by agonizing peace. And then there were the field agents, the Katsas. Yael was chosen to lead the infiltration team. His real name was not Yael. His identity was a carefully constructed fiction. He was born in Argentina to Holocaust survivors, a background that gave him a visceral understanding of the stakes. He was recruited in the early 70s, and his first major success was the infiltration of a Palestinian cell in Beirut, an operation that led to the preemption of 3 separate terror attacks in Europe. He was a ghost, a master of blending in, of becoming invisible in plain sight. He was chosen for this mission because of his flawless French and his background in mechanical engineering. He could not only plant a bomb, he could understand the machine he was destroying. On the other side of the board was Saddam Hussein, and more immediately, his chief nuclear scientist, Dr. Yahya al-Mossad. Al-Mossad was an Egyptian-born, British-educated nuclear physicist. He was brilliant, ambitious, and a fervent Arab nationalist who believed a nuclear weapon was the only way to guarantee the Arab world's security against Israel and the West. He was the driving force behind the Iraqi program, the man who translated Saddam's ambition into technical reality. He managed the contracts, oversaw the training of Iraqi scientists in France, and personally supervised the design specifications. To stop Osirak, Mossad knew they had to stop al-Mossad. The geopolitical chessboard was treacherous. The late 1970s were a time of shifting alliances. The United States, under President Carter, was pushing a strong non-proliferation agenda, but was wary of direct confrontation with France, a key NATO ally. The Soviet Union was Iraq's primary military supplier and saw the nuclear program as a way to increase its influence in the region. France was caught between its economic interests and its international reputation. They needed the Iraqi oil and the weapons and technology contracts that came with it. Mossad was on its own. They had no allies in this fight. Every action had to be deniable. Every failure would be catastrophic. The initial strategy was one of attrition and intimidation. Mossad began a campaign to disrupt the supply chain. Companies across Europe that were contracted to provide components for the Osirak project began to experience mysterious problems. A factory in Italy that produced specialized cooling pumps suffered a series of unexplained fires. A shipment of reinforced steel from a German supplier was found to be contaminated with a corrosive agent upon arrival in Iraq, rendering it useless. These were pinpricks, designed to cause delays and sow doubt. They also targeted the personnel. Iraqi scientists training in France were approached by Mossad agents posing as journalists or academics. They were offered money, asylum, a new life in the West. Some were threatened, their families in Iraq placed under subtle surveillance. The message was clear: walk away from this project. The campaign culminated in a direct operation against the program's leader. In June 1980, Dr. Yahya al-Mossad was found dead in his room at the Le Méridien Hotel in Paris. He had been bludgeoned and stabbed to death. French police suspected a crime of passion involving a prostitute, a narrative Mossad subtly encouraged through planted news stories. It was, in fact, an assassination carried out by a Caesarea team. The goal was to decapitate the program, but it failed. Saddam simply appointed a successor and accelerated the timeline. The project, slowed but not stopped, continued. The intimidation campaign had bought time, but it hadn't solved the fundamental problem. The reactor cores themselves were the heart of the program. Once they were built, tested, and shipped to Iraq, the path to a bomb would be irreversible. The focus of Operation Sphinx shifted. The new target was the factory itself. Constructions Navales et Industrielles de la Méditerranée, or CNIM, in the port town of La Seine-sur-Mer, near Toulon on the French Riviera. The intelligence that triggered the final phase of the operation came from a source codenamed Viper. Viper was a high-level executive within a Swiss company that brokered the financial transactions between France and Iraq. In late 1978, Viper provided Miriam with a document. It was a revised delivery schedule. The 2 reactor cores were nearing completion. They were scheduled to be loaded onto a cargo ship, the Scheersburg A, on April 7, 1979. They would be transported from Toulon, through the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal, to Basra. Once they sailed, they would be unstoppable. The report landed on the desk of Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. Begin, a Holocaust survivor himself, had a deeply ingrained philosophy he called the Begin Doctrine. It stated that Israel would never allow an enemy nation to obtain weapons of mass destruction. He read Miriam's report, looked at the shipping date, and saw an existential threat. He convened a meeting with Hofi and his top military advisors. The options were laid out. An airstrike on the factory in France was impossible. It would be an act of war against a Western power. An attack on the ship at sea was considered. A plan was drawn up to use a submarine to torpedo the Scheersburg A in the middle of the Mediterranean. But the risks were immense. An environmental disaster, the potential for international condemnation, the possibility of failure. Hofi argued for a third option, a surgical, deniable ground operation, an attack on the cores before they were ever loaded onto the ship. It was audacious. It meant inserting a Mossad team into a high-security industrial facility on the soil of a friendly, if uncooperative, nation. Begin was a man of action. He looked at Hofi. "Can you guarantee success?" he asked. Hofi met his gaze. "In our business, there are no guarantees. Only probabilities. I can guarantee we will try." Begin paused, then gave a single, sharp nod. Operation Sphinx was greenlit. The clock was ticking. They had less than 6 months to plan and execute one of the most daring acts of sabotage in modern history. The plan Amir laid out was built on a foundation of meticulous, painstaking intelligence gathering. The first phase required establishing a presence in Toulon without attracting the attention of the French Domestic Intelligence Service, the DST. A 3-person surveillance team was dispatched. Their leader was a woman named Sylvie, a French-born Israeli who could pass as a native. Her cover was as a doctoral student in marine biology, studying coastal pollution in the Toulon Bay. Her 2 partners posed as freelance photographers on assignment for a yachting magazine. Their real job was to live and breathe the CNIM facility. From a rented apartment with a clear line of sight to the shipyard's main gate, they began their work. For 4 months, they documented everything. They photographed every employee, every delivery truck. They logged the license plate numbers, cross-referencing them with public records to build a profile of the workforce. They recorded the timing of the guard patrols, noting that the night shift was less rigorous, often cutting corners on their routes. They identified the security systems, pressure plates on the perimeter fence, microwave motion detectors on the roofs, and a network of closed-circuit television cameras. Miriam, back in Tel Aviv, took this raw data and built a 3-dimensional model of the factory's routines. She discovered a pattern. The cameras on the northern fence, covering what should have been a secure zone, had a recurring blind spot. Due to a software glitch in the system that controlled the camera's sweep patterns. A 12-second window occurred every 47 minutes, during which a specific 10-meter section of fence was not under visual surveillance. It was a tiny flaw, a ghost in the machine, but it was the gap they needed. While the surveillance team worked, a separate logistics cell was established in Paris. Headed by a Katsa named Claude, their mission was to procure the equipment and provide support for the infiltration team. This was not a simple shopping trip. Everything had to be sterile, untraceable to Israel. The thermal lance was purchased in pieces from 3 different industrial supply stores in Belgium and Germany, then assembled in a safe house. The climbing gear was bought from a mountaineering shop in Switzerland. The getaway car, a nondescript Peugeot 305, was bought for cash from a used car dealer in Lyon. Each item was a potential breadcrumb that could lead back to them. The infiltration team, Yael and Ronan, entered France separately, on forged passports. Yael arrived as a Canadian businessman exploring import-export opportunities. Ronan came in as an Argentinian tourist on a backpacking trip through Europe. They never met in public. Their communication was handled through a system of dead drops and coded messages left in newspaper-classified ads. Their primary communication technology was a short-range burst transmitter designed by Danny. The device, no larger than a pack of cigarettes, digitized a voice message, compressed it, and transmitted it in a 0.7-second burst on a constantly shifting frequency. To an outside listener, it would sound like a meaningless burst of static. Its weakness was its range, under 5 kilometers. Meaning the command post had to be established perilously close to the target. The command post was Sylvie's apartment. It was from there that Amir would oversee the operation on the night. The technology they carried was a testament to Danny's genius. The core cracker-shaped charges were the centerpiece. Standard military explosives create a spherical blast wave designed for maximum destruction. Danny's charges used the Misnay-Chardin effect. The explosive was shaped into a concave lens, which focused the blast energy into a single, high-velocity jet of molten metal, like a focused drill bit. This jet could penetrate the reactor's steel casing, but the majority of the blast energy would be directed inwards, shredding the delicate internal components while minimizing the external explosion and the noise it would create. This was crucial for maintaining deniability. It had to look like a mysterious industrial accident, not a military-style bombing. Another key piece of tech was a device they called the Cricketer. It was an ultrasonic emitter designed to disable the microwave motion detectors on the factory roof. It broadcasted a high-frequency signal that overloaded the sensors, making them register a constant state of no motion without triggering an alarm. Its limitation was battery life. It could only operate for a maximum of 20 minutes, which dictated the precise window they had to get from the perimeter fence to the assembly hall entrance. The plan was set. The team would move on the night of April 5th. Yael and Ronan would approach the northern fence. The surveillance team would monitor the camera feeds and give them the signal to move during the 12-second blind spot. They would cut the fence, cross the open yard, use the Cricketer to disable the roof sensors, and gain entry to Hall 7 through a ventilation shaft on the roof. They would plant the charges and exfiltrate the same way. The charges would be detonated remotely 4 hours later, once the entire team was clear of the Toulon area. It was a clean, elegant plan, and it fell apart completely 72 hours before the mission was scheduled to begin. The first setback came from Sylvie's surveillance post. A work crew arrived at the northern perimeter fence. Unscheduled, unexpected. They began installing a new security system. It was a state-of-the-art fiber optic vibration sensor woven into the chain links, a taut wire system. Cutting the fence, or even climbing it, would now trigger an immediate alarm by altering the light transmission properties of the fiber. The 12-second camera blind spot was irrelevant. Their entry point was gone. A frantic, encrypted burst transmission went from Toulon to Tel Aviv. Amir convened an emergency meeting in the apartment. The mood was grim. Aborting was a possibility, but the shipping date of April 7th was a hard deadline. They had to find a new way in. Miriam, working non-stop for 36 hours, scoured the data they had collected. She found a potential alternative. The factory received a nightly delivery of industrial gases, argon and nitrogen, from a local supplier around 1 a.m. The truck always entered through the main gate, but its destination was a storage depot at the far end of the complex, near Hall 7. The security protocol for the truck was lax. A single guard would check the driver's paperwork and wave him through. The truck was a standard canvas-backed flatbed. It was a high-risk proposal. It meant smuggling Yael and Ronan in under the noses of the front gate security. But it was their only option. The plan was revised. They would have to intercept the truck before it reached the factory. They had to do it without harming the driver, a French civilian. They would borrow the truck for 2 hours. A new set of problems emerged. How to stop the truck? How to ensure the driver didn't report it stolen immediately? The logistics team in Paris went into overdrive. They acquired a second, identical truck. They also acquired a tranquilizer gun and a fast-acting sedative, ketamine, from a sympathetic veterinarian in Marseille. The new plan: Yael and Ronan would block a quiet country road on the truck's route. Posing as a broken-down vehicle, they would force the delivery truck to stop. They would sedate the driver, move him to their identical truck, and have a third team member drive him to a secluded spot to sleep it off for a few hours. Yael and Ronan would then drive the original truck with the real cargo and paperwork into the CNIM facility. They would have to hide inside the storage depot, wait for the area to be clear, and then move to Hall 7. It was messy, complicated, and had a dozen new points of failure. As they were finalizing the details of this new, desperate plan, the second setback struck. Their primary local asset, a disgruntled union foreman at the shipyard codenamed Le Chat, disappeared. Le Chat had been providing them with crucial last-minute intelligence. Changes in guard shifts, updated security patrols, and the internal layout of Hall 7. He was